Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So as you just said, what I propose is to have a quick overview of the main results that have been accumulated over time from epidemiological studies of miners, uranium miners mainly. So to begin with this story, uranium mining has been intensively developed from after the Second World War, from the mid-40s to the 50s. And a point which is noticeable is that protection measures have been introduced in the mines very quickly, as early as the mid-50s in the mines. The first epidemiological studies have been launched in the 60s, and radon has been classified as a lung carcinogen in 1988, so approximately 30 years after the beginning of the epidemiological studies. The first studies of indoor radon have been launched in the 90s, and today most of the mines, at least in Europe, are closed, but the follow-up of these miners is continuing. So if you look at the epidemiological studies, so minor cohorts, most of them have been elaborated, have been launched in North America, so Canada, the United States, Europe, and one in China, tin miners, and one also here in Australia, the Radium Hill, so a few hundreds of kilometers in the north of Adelaide, cohort of more than 1,500 miners that have been followed up to the mid of the 90s, as far as I remember. And so approximately 15 cohorts have been elaborated in the world with well, different characteristics, some of small size, a little bit more than 1,000 workers, up to very large cohorts. The German cohort is including almost 60,000 miners in one very large cohort. Many different reports have been published. Well, the list is here. I'm not going to go through all these ones, but mainly reports from the beer reports, beer 4, beer 6. So from the NRC in the US, also UNSCARE publications in '88, in 2000, in 2006, and very recently in 2019, and also ICRP report, especially publication 65 in '93 and publication 115 in 2010. So if you look at these different cohorts, what are the main results? Well, first, these cohorts have demonstrated that there was an excess risk of lung cancer in the populations of miners, especially uranium miners. And that this risk of lung cancer, so the relative risk of lung cancer, relative risk of lung cancer, which is presented here, is increasing. So the probability of lung cancer is increasing with the cumulative radon exposure, which is presented here on the x-axis. The unit is indicated in the original unit of exposure among the miners, working level months, which is just concentration in the mine multiplied by the time spent by each of the workers. Sorry, it's moving alone, and that's what you have here. So the relationships in the mines are not based on doses; they are based on a level of exposure, cumulative exposure of the workers over their whole occupational life. And this is the results of a pooled analysis published at the end of the 90s. But most of the studies have demonstrated a dose risk, an exposure risk relationship, a significant exposure risk relationship, as the one which is presented here. Another main result is that this relationship, the increase in the excess relative risk associated to cumulative exposure, well, this risk is modified by different factors, especially age, and another one is time since exposure. That's what is presented here. After 5 years after the beginning of the exposure, you have a very important increase in the strength of the association, so in the excess relative risk, which is decreasing afterward to come back after, let's say, 30 years after the end of the exposure to a risk which is very similar to the one of a non-exposed person. So a kind of a strong time-since exposure effect with a sharp increase of risk, which is diminishing with time after exposure. Another important result is the relationship with smoking. As you know, smoking is the main risk factor for lung cancer, and most of the different cohorts that have been conducted among minors did not provide any information about smoking, but some information has been available in some subsets of these different cohorts. This slide just presents you the result of a combined analysis of data from the Czech, the French, and the German cohorts, so European minors, providing information about smoking status and radon exposure. And what you can see here on this graph is that the relative risk of both factors, so here it's the effect of smoking among non-exposed, but what you can see is that the three categories of smoking habits, you have an increase of the risk of lung cancer, so with cumulative radon exposure. And the increased slope is approximately the same in these three different categories. So these results and other studies have demonstrated the persistence of an association between radon and lung cancer risk, even after controlling for smoking, with an interaction between both factors that we consider to be submultiplicative. So a little bit less than a multiplication of the risk of the two factors, but more than the addition of the two factors. Another strong impact is the period of exposure. I will go in more details on that. This slide presents you the evolution of the workers in the French cohort of uranium miners. The blue bars are presenting the number of miners every year, and the pink line here is presenting the mean level of exposure still in working level months. What you can see is that there is a strong change in 56 on this slide after the implementation of radiation protection in the mines. So of course the methods of exploitation of the uranium have changed a lot. In the 40s it was completely different from the modern methods from what we saw in the morning, the exploitation of the uranium in the mines. But in addition, there have been some changes due to radiation protection, especially ventilation, forced ventilation in the mines. And you can see there is a strong decrease in the levels of exposure, and also the beginning of the individual monitoring of the exposures that play a role on the decreasing of the risk. Before this, you can have miners with very high levels of exposure. Here, we reach more than 100 working level months. According to the dose conversion coefficients that have been elaborated in the 90s, 1 working level month is corresponding approximately to 5 millisievert effective dose. So it means that for these guys, it was approximately a dose of 500 millisievert per year effective dose, which is very high. It leads to the strong interest, finally, to lead cohorts today to have analysis being based only on the miners that were working in the mine after the implementation of the radiological protections, and so individual monitoring and strong ventilation with low level of exposure over time. This slide presents the same results, so thank you, I don't know if he's in the room, but to Augusto who provided me the slide. And this is exactly the same from the German cohort. So as I told you, that's the largest cohort in the world. But we have exactly the same effect, with a strong decrease at the beginning of the 60s after implementation of radiation protection in the mines. And again, you can see that there is a very large difference between the early years and the subsequent years after, let's say, the mid of the 60s, with doses that can be exposures that can be even higher in the bismuth cohort. 350 corresponds to a dose which is between 1 and 2 sieverts per year. So it was really very high levels of dose in the early years in the mines. And again, so justifying the pertinence of having results based only on workers exposed in the mines, but after in the recent periods with low chronic exposures. That's what is presented here on this slide, so which is extracted from the very recent UNSCARE report, which is still under publication. And this table presents you the results when we consider the entire cohorts in the different cohorts in the world, with the coefficient, the mean coefficient, which is 0.6 per 100 working level months. And here, exactly the same cohorts, but considering only the workers with low levels of exposure or that have been employed in the recent periods. And what we can see is that finally, in all of the cohorts, the coefficient is stronger, from 2 to 5 times. In the Bismuth cohort, the coefficient is approximately 5 times higher. If we consider the recent period or if we consider the total cohort. And this analysis of the recent periods is today possible. It was not possible in the 90s because the duration of follow-up was not enough. But today it is possible to consider only the workers employed during these periods with significant results in each of the cohorts. And you can see that in addition, the results outside of the Bismuth cohort, the results are very, very similar between the different cohorts, much more similar, with a very good homogeneity of the results, much more than if you consider the total cohorts. The potential explanation for such a difference between the total cohorts and the recent periods, the first one is what I said. That's the effect of very high exposure rates in the early years, with very high level of doses and with potentially other causes, other pathologies than lung cancer due to the levels of exposure. The second one is the high uncertainty of exposure in these early periods. Clearly, during these periods, the early periods, the measurements were not individually recorded. It was reconstructed retrospectively by experts. And so the uncertainties are much higher than after the implementation of radiological protection. And we think that due to this mechanism of retrospective reconstruction, there has been overestimation, and this overestimation may also contribute to the lower strengths of association with the high levels that were in the early periods of mining. And the last parameter is what I just explained before. Potentially, the decrease of the association with time since exposure may play a role in the difference between the recent periods and the entire cohorts. This slide presents a synthesis of the recent results. It's also extracted from the recent UNSCARE review. You find back the results for the total cohort here, for the cohorts based on low exposed miners. And you can see that this result is in the same unit, so per 100 working level months. The result coming from the indoor residential studies, so indoor radon studies. And you can see that the coefficient, the strength of the association seems to be much closer to the recent periods of miners than to the complete total cohorts. So to finish, what we can say from these results is that finally, yes, the results from the total cohorts are very coherent with the results we had in the 90s, because it's based on the same population. It's just an extension of the duration of follow-up for a few years. But if we consider the cohorts restricted to recent mining periods, then we have a coefficient which is approximately twice, and which is very consistent with the results from the indoor studies, even if there are still large uncertainties associated to each of these different results. So to summarize the different results we had that have been collected from miners cohorts, we can say that all of the different cohorts demonstrated an excess risk of lung cancer mortality, but also an association between the level of exposure, the cumulated exposure of the miners, and the probability to have lung cancer mortality. That this association is persisting if we consider low exposed miners, and also if we consider the measurements error associated to this to the exposure indicators. That there is a strong decrease with attained age and with time since exposure, that the association between radon and lung cancer persists after consideration of smoking. Some studies, a few studies, have been considering the dose to the lung, so taking into account not only the dose due to radon, but also due to gamma and to uranium dust, and demonstrated that there is an association between dose and lung cancer risk. The maximum of the dose, 90% of the dose, being due to the radon decay products to the lung. And the last point is that at the time being, at least, there is no coherent results to show an association between radon exposure and organs other than lung cancer. Even if some of the cohorts have shown localized excess that have to be confirmed in the future. So from all these results have been a synthesis of all these results have been published by the ICRP in 2010 in publication 115, and based on these different on this review, the calculation of lifetime risk has been performed. So this result presents you the results that were available in the 90s based on the ICRP 65. At that time, the calculation of lifetime risk is not directly a result of the epidemiology, but from the results of the epidemiological studies, and with some assumptions on the baseline rates and on the distribution of the population, you can calculate the probability to have lung cancer up to a given age, lifetime risk up to the age of 90 years. And so if you can do it for radon, that's what has been done here. So the lifetime risk is 2.8 per 10,000 people. You can compare it with the lifetime risk to have the detriment, the lifetime risk of cancer due to an external exposure. And dividing this by this, you can derive what we call a dose conversion factor, so a dose coefficient, which was 5 in the 90s. With the review of, that has been published in publication 115, the conclusion was that finally, considering recent low exposed minors, this lifetime risk calculation was increased to a value of 5 per 10,000. And with the same approach, so dividing by the detriment, finally it leads to a dose coefficient which is approximately twice higher. I'm not going to go in more detail in this discussion, but it will be the talk of John IRSN in a few minutes. But clearly, the cohorts of minors are a main input in the estimation of the dose coefficients. Another comparison is that, another result is that calculation of lifetime risk have been performed also by the IRSN in the recent, in the ongoing report, using 2 different models. I'm not going to go in details, but that's 2 different ways to consider the impact of the exposure rate. And you can see that the combined results obtained in the review of the IRSN is 5 per 10,000 also, so very similar to what has been published in publication 115 by the ICRP, even if the variation between the different cohorts includes variation between 3 and 7 approximately, the minimum value being provided by the German study, the Bismuth study. And so that's the explanation of the current differences between the interpretation of the ICRP and the IRSN. Finally, if we really look at the review of the scientific evidence, the review that has been performed by both of these organisms are very good and are very consistent. But there are differences in the interpretation. The ICRP finally has given a prevalence to the results of the low exposed minors, because these results, this population is closer to the population concerned by radiological protection, and because it's coherent with the indoor studies. On the other side, the IRSN, with the same review of significant evidence, is preferring the cohorts with the largest statistical power. So the cohort including the maximum of minors, and finally the complete cohorts, including also the workers employed in the early periods. I think John will come back to this point also. So to conclude, what I would like to remain is that minor studies are clearly one of the major sources of knowledge for the assessment of radon-associated risk in support radiological protection. It was the case in the past, and it's still the case today. These studies, the review of evidence, show a strong evidence for an association between radon exposure and lung cancer risk, even at low levels of exposure, even if we focus only on the miners that have been employed during a period in which radiation protection measures were implemented in the mines. These results are highly consistent between the different cohorts, and even if uncertainties persist. And there is also a good coherence with the other sources of information, especially the results from the indoor studies and provided by the dosimetric estimates. And the differences between the NSCAR and the ICRP are not in the review of the evidence, epidemiological evidence today, but in a choice to have different indicators corresponding to different objectives. The last slide is to say that finally these cohorts have provided a lot of results, but they are still able to provide additional information. There is a very large project. The name is PUMA, so the Pooled Uranium Miner Analysis, which is a combination of 7 cohorts of uranium miners, including more than 125,000 miners, with a very long duration of follow-up, more than 36 years as a mean. And the expected results are an even better estimate of lung cancer risk at low levels of exposure, a better estimation of the modifying factors, the interaction with smoking, and to look at potential effects other than lung cancer in these populations of miners. I'm finishing to say that this part of this presentation has been elaborated in the frame of C1 and C2 ICRP task group 64. The list of the members is presented here. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dominique, for your clear presentations, which helps us to better understand the difference of approach between ICRP and SCARE. That was not clear to me. Now it's very clear. Thank you very much. We have some questions, and we have also some remaining time. So smoking has been considered, but as inhalable dust, respirable dust, silica, and so on, been considered?
Yes and no. It has not been, the information is not always available in the different cohorts. So there are several cohorts in which it has been possible to be taken into account, especially in the bismuth cohort. So well, we can discuss it further, but it has been possible, yes, to perform analysis of the relationship between radon and lung cancer risk, taking into account additional exposures like silica, like arsenic, and so on. In general, it can modify the relationship, but the relationship between radon and lung cancer risk is still there.
Okay, it turns out that the 3 questions we have are more or less the same. So if there are any, yes, François?
Yes, I have a question regarding the difference between UNSCEAR and ICRP, because you said that UNSCEAR preferred to choose the study that has the highest statistical power. And my understanding was that the statistical power was useful before we do an experiment. But after we have done an experiment, we don't care about the statistical power. What is important is the final uncertainty, or the confidence interval.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I'm using statistical power, but I should say the smallest statistical uncertainty. That's what is presented here. No, not here. No, sorry, I come back. No, so you're right. So the statistical power provides the capacity to identify and to determine the effect and play a large role on the confidence interval that you have in the end. What we are looking at here is the final confidence interval. What you can see on this slide is that from the full cohorts, you have a confidence interval which is varying from 0.3 to 0.8, so a difference of approximately 0.5. And if you consider the minor scores with the recent periods, it's varying from 1.1 to 1.9, so 0.8. You can see that indeed the confidence interval is smaller here, but it's not so different. And in my view, it's much better to focus on the recent periods in which the data are much better than to focus on the full cohorts. But well, on a statistical point of view, you can have some arguments for that.
Any other last question? If not, thank you once again, Dominique, for your presentation.